There is a particular stillness that comes over the body when it has been pushed very far. Not the stillness of sleep, but something older, a stillness that follows great exertion, when the limbs grow heavy and the breath slows, and the skin becomes sensitive to small things. The press of fabric against the forearm, the particular temperature of air at the edge of a window, the faint sound of wind finding the gap beneath a door. You may have felt something like it after a long day of difficult work, or at the end of a season that asked more of you than you thought you could give. There is an almost mineral quality to that kind of quiet. The body becomes very simple. It knows only that it is warm and still, and that the darkness pressing in at the edges of sight is not something to fear but something to receive, something it has been moving toward all day without knowing. It is into that quality of quietness that this night's story lives. Not the conflict that history has sometimes placed at its center. That is not what concerns us here, not what lingers, but the long spaces around it. The cold mornings before the world fully woke. The forests dense enough to muffle all ordinary sound. The fires built small and careful against the dark, and the men who sat beside them, learning to be patient in a particular way. The slow process by which one kind of person becomes something else, something they could not have been as a child, something they had to travel a great distance to find. What concerns us is the human interior of it, the longing, the devotion, the strange peace that sometimes waits on the other side of extremity. The way a man might spend years becoming more than himself, and then, in the quiet afterward, sit by a fire and be entirely ordinary again. And so if you are lying down now, let your shoulders settle. If there is a blanket, let it be heavy. The night is long and unhurried, and what follows is told slowly, meant to be received slowly. 1,000 years of northern air carrying it gently toward you across everything that has happened in between. In the far north of Europe, where the winters lasted long enough that people learned to carry their warmth inside themselves, where the sea froze in certain harbors and the sun in deepest winter barely cleared the horizon before turning away again, there lived a people whose relationship with the natural world was one of intimacy rather than distance. The Norse, those seafaring, farming, storytelling people of Scandinavia, understood the land and its creatures not as backdrop, but as participant. The bear that moved through the birch forest. The wolf that howled from the ridge above the settlement in the brief hours of darkness. The raven that watched from high branches with an intelligence that seemed almost deliberate, almost knowing. These were not merely animals. They were presences, forces with their own interior lives, their own spiritual weight, their own territories that overlapped with human territory in ways that required acknowledgement. For a certain kind of young man in this world, the animal was also a doorway. The men who would come to be called berserkers, berserkr in Old Norse, a word whose roots scholars have puzzled over for generations, existed within Norse society as something set apart from the ordinary categories of farmer, merchant, or sailor. The word itself carries two possible meanings, and both of them are evocative in different ways. The first is berserk, from bur, meaning bear, and serkr, meaning coat or garment. These were men who wore the skin of a bear into the places where violence would occur, wrapping themselves in the animal's hide the way a person might wrap themselves in the identity of something larger and older than themselves, something that predated the settlements and the ships and the carved rune stones and all the architecture of human life. The second interpretation, proposed by the great Icelandic historian and poet Snorri Sturluson in the 13th century, suggests bare-shirt men who went into combat without the protection of armor, their bodies exposed as a form of offering, a declaration that they had moved beyond ordinary calculation of safety and risk. Most scholars today favor the bare-shirt reading, given the weight of archaeological and literary evidence pointing toward animal skin ritual. But perhaps in the deep symbolic logic of the Norse mind, both meanings were present at once, layered within the same syllable the way a winter sky can contain both the memory of light and the certainty of darkness. The earliest surviving mention of these warriors appears in a skaldic poem called the Harald Fairhair, composed in the late 9th century by a poet named Thorbjorn Hornklofi in honor of King Harald Fairhair, the first king to bring the scattered chieftaincies of Norway under a single rule. The poem is spare and muscular, as skaldic poetry tends to be, built of compressed images and kennings, those poetic compounds that the Norse poets used the way a carpenter uses joints, fitting one meaning inside another. In it, the poet asks after certain warriors of Harald's household and answers his own question. Wolf-skinned they are called. They bear bloody shields in battle. Red with blood are their spears when they come to fight. They form a closed group. The prince in his wisdom puts his trust in such men who hack through enemy shields. These were the berserkers in their earliest documented form, not myth, not pure legend, but living men whom the poets had seen or heard described, men whose existence was specific enough to be worth naming in verse meant to outlast its author. That they were already being called by this name in the late 9th century tells us the tradition was older still, rooted in practices that predated the age of the great kings, rooted perhaps in a time before the Norse even thought of themselves as Norse, when the tribes of northern Europe moved through a world that was mostly forest, and the animals within it were the primary teachers of what the world required. To understand the berserker is to understand something about the Norse relationship with Odin, and Odin is not a simple figure. He is not the comfortable, approachable deity of hearth and harvest. He is something more unsettling, more paradoxical, a god who sought wisdom by sacrificing one of his own eyes at the well of Mimir, who hung from the world tree Yggdrasil for 9 days and 9 nights to discover the runes, who wandered the roads of the world in disguise, testing and sometimes betraying the humans who encountered him. He was called the All-Father, but he was not fatherly in any reassuring sense. He was the god of what the Norse called Other, a word usually translated as fury or inspiration, but meaning something that contains both of those, something that lives precisely at their intersection, the place where making and unmaking become difficult to distinguish. The name Odin derives from this same root. He is, at his core, the god of divine madness, the kind of madness that can create great poetry or great violence, that can illuminate or destroy, that burns through the ordinary self and leaves something both less and more in its wake. The berserkers were, in this understanding, not merely soldiers in a military sense. They were devotees. Their practice was a form of worship. When the fury came upon them, when the berserkergang, the going berserk, the entering of the state, arrived in the body and took hold, they were not simply experiencing a biochemical event. They were, in their own understanding and in the understanding of everyone around them, becoming briefly the instrument of the gods' particular quality of attention. They were other made flesh, divine madness given hands and teeth, and the weight of a body in motion. Snorri Sturluson, writing in his Unglinga saga around the turn of the 13th century, gave what remains the most famous description of these warriors. Drawing on earlier sources and on the oral traditions that still carried some trace of living memory, he wrote, "Odin's men rushed forwards without armor, were as mad as dogs or wolves, bit their shields, and were strong as bears or wild oxen. They killed people at a blow, and neither fire nor iron told upon them." This was called berserkergang. What Snorri is describing is a kind of possession, though a self-cultivated one, a state that the warrior had learned to enter through years of training and ritual, and what we might now call the deliberate management of his own deepest psychology. The frenzy was not accidental. It was not something that simply happened to these men. It was, in some important sense, a practice that had been developed and refined across generations. Within this tradition, there were distinct groupings, each devoted to a different animal spirit. The berserkers proper aligned themselves with the bear, that massive, nearly tireless creature who could absorb tremendous punishment and continue moving, who emerged from winter sleep with a power and a hunger that seemed almost inexhaustible. Their counterparts, the Ulfhithnar, the wolf coats, wrapped themselves in wolf pelts and understood themselves as channeling the wolf, swift, pack-minded, relentless in pursuit, capable of reading the movements of others and adjusting in real time. A third group, the Svinfylking, associated themselves with the wild boar, an animal sacred to the Vanir gods of fertility and abundance, dense and nearly unstoppable in the charge, its tusks capable of opening any obstacle. These were not casual affiliations or metaphors for personality types. They were identities carried across the whole of a warrior's adult life, embedded in the animal skin he wore, and the rituals he observed, and the particular quality of attention he cultivated in himself during the long months between the times his extraordinary capacity was needed. There is a question that has occupied scholars and physicians and curious people for a very long time, and it is a question that has no entirely settled answer. What was the berserkergang exactly? What happened inside the body and the mind of a man who entered that state? The Norse sources, written centuries after the warriors themselves lived and fought, speak of a trembling that came over the body before the fury arrived, a kind of shaking or shivering that those who witnessed it described with some consistency. Then the howling. Then the biting of shield rims. Then a heat that seemed to fill the body from within, radiating outward, making the skin flush and the eyes bright, and the voice change into something closer to the sounds the animal made. And through all of this, a disappearance of what we might call ordinary self-awareness, the thinking, calculating, hesitating self that most people carry with them, most of the time simply cease to direct events. The sources also speak of what the body became during the state, stronger than it ordinarily was, faster, apparently impervious to wounds that should have registered as wounds. Snorri's phrase, "neither fire nor iron told upon them," appears and reappears across the saga literature, with a consistency that suggests it was not mere poetic exaggeration, but a genuine report of something that witnesses had observed and been unable to account for. The wounds were there afterward. The burns, when fire had touched them, were there afterward. But during the state, these men had continued moving, as though the body had simply not received the news. Modern medicine offers some ways to think about this. The human body under extreme stress releases adrenaline and cortisol in quantities that can genuinely suppress the experience of pain, can genuinely increase muscular output, can genuinely narrow attention to such a sharp and concentrated point that peripheral information, including the information of injury, falls away entirely. Endorphins, the body's own pain-killing chemicals, flood the system in moments of sustained physical extremity in quantities that can produce something approaching euphoria alongside their analgesic effects. The brain's attentional systems, flooded with these compounds, become so tightly focused on the immediate task that ordinary self-monitoring and self-protection cease to operate. People have lifted vehicles from injured relatives. People have run distances that should have been anatomically impossible and felt the damage only when the emergency was over. In this physiological sense, what the sagas describe as the inability of iron or fire to truly affect a berserker is not outside the range of documented human experience. The fire and the iron touched the body. The body simply did not report back in its usual way, and by the time the reporting resumed, the battle was over. Beyond adrenaline and endorphins, there is another layer of explanation that the research of the last several decades has made available. The state the berserkers entered, the dissociation of ordinary self-awareness from the body in action, the amnesia that some warriors reportedly experienced around the time of the berserkergang, the sense of being inhabited by something other than the ordinary self. These features map, imperfectly but suggestively, onto what modern psychology describes as dissociative states. States in which the boundaries of the self become porous, in which the monitoring, narrating self steps back or is overwhelmed, and the body acts from something deeper and more automatic than conscious decision. These states can be induced by extreme stress, by rhythmic repetitive action, by certain kinds of ritual, by sleep deprivation, by physical exhaustion. The berserkers, through their years of practice, may have learned or been taught how to deliberately induce something in this family of experiences, a controlled loss of control, a surrender that was paradoxically also a skill. Other scholars have proposed that certain specific preparations contributed to the state. Some saga accounts suggest that warriors consumed fermented drinks before battle. Others have pointed to the possibility of psychoactive plants, though the evidence for any particular substance is thin, and the scholarly consensus tends towards skepticism about the drug hypothesis as a primary explanation. More compelling to most who have studied the question carefully is the role of psychological conditioning accumulated over years. The absolute certainty of a warrior who had spent months in the wilderness becoming the bear, who had internalized the identity so thoroughly that when the moment came to embody it, he had only to step aside and let the thing he had become take over. a man who genuinely believed himself to be the instrument of Odin's own fury, who had trained that belief into the muscle and the bone over years of ritual and practice, would bring to the moment of battle a quality of commitment and a freedom from self-preservation that to onlookers, without that context, would have appeared extraordinary to the point of being supernatural. The training itself began long before any battle, and it began in landscape. There is a thread of evidence in the sagas suggesting that young men who were to become berserkers underwent an extended period of initiation that involved time in the wilderness, alone, or with a small group of older warriors, separated from the warmth and sociality of the settlement and the longhouse, living in the manner of the animal they would eventually embody. For those who would become bear warriors, this meant something slow and deliberate. Long days of patience, nights of cold endured without complaint, the learning of a certain quality of stillness that the bear itself possessed, the ability to sit with discomfort without the discomfort becoming the central fact. For those who would become wolf warriors, it meant something faster and more collaborative, learning to move in coordinated groups through difficult terrain, to read the movements of others and respond without verbal communication, to sustain pursuit long past the point where ordinary fatigue would have required a stop. This wilderness period was not merely practical training. It was transformative in the way that all genuine initiations are transformative. A threshold crossed between one identity and another, a deliberate dismantling of the ordinary self so that something else could be constructed in its place. The scholar Daniel McCoy, who has written extensively on Norse shamanic traditions, has noted that the initiation structures of these warrior societies parallel shamanic practices found across many northern cultures, traditions in which the candidate undergoes a symbolic death and rebirth, emerging from the wilderness as something qualitatively different from what they were when they entered. The hide of the totem animal worn afterward was not costume or decoration. It was testimony, an outward declaration of what had happened inside, a visible marker of the transformation that the wilderness had accomplished. The Volsunga Saga, one of the great narrative poems of the Norse tradition, contains an account that scholars have read as a description of exactly this kind of initiation. In it, the older warrior Sigmund and the younger Sinfjatli don wolf skins and go into the forest, and during their time there they are wholly wolves, unable to remove the skins, living as the animal lives. They emerge from the forest changed, the wolf quality now carried within rather than without, the skins discarded because they are no longer needed as external markers of an internal state. The story is told as myth, as the sagas always are, the literal and the symbolic wound together so tightly that separating them is not quite possible, and perhaps not quite the point. In the quiet evenings after their return from such initiations, these warriors would have sat near fires in the longhouses of their patrons, eating simply, speaking in the careful way of men who had learned to conserve themselves, listening to the older warriors tell the stories that shaped the tradition. The skaldic poets among them, and there were many, for the devotees of Odin were often warrior poets, the two callings understood as expressions of the same fundamental gift, would compose verses that moved between the violent and the contemplative with the ease of men for whom that movement was natural. Egil Skallagrimson, one of the most famous figures associated with berserker qualities in the sagas, was simultaneously a fighter of ferocious reputation and a poet of such technical skill and emotional depth that his verses were preserved and copied for centuries after his death. His grief at the loss of his sons produced poems that rank among the most moving in Old Norse literature. His capacity for fury and his capacity for tenderness were not contradictions. They were different expressions of the same intensive relationship with the felt world. The role these warriors played in the military architecture of the Viking Age was specific and deliberate, a considered deployment of particular human capabilities. Norse kings who were consolidating power, and during the 9th and 10th centuries, Scandinavia was full of such kings, each working the complex mechanics of alliance and intimidation and military dominance that power consolidation requires, understood the value of a group of fighters whose reputation alone could cause enemy formations to waver before contact was even made. King Harald Fairhair placed his berserkers at the front of the formation, the sharpened point of the wedge that struck first and hardest, the opening shock through which the rest of the warband would pour. Snorri records that Harald's berserkers were ranked among his herdmen, his household warriors, his inner circle, and treated with a status equivalent to royal bodyguards. They were not marginal figures, not men who were merely tolerated because of their usefulness. They were valued and honored precisely because of what set them apart. The psychological effect of their appearance and behavior in battle was not incidental to their military function. It was the function, or at least a significant part of it. A line of ordinary fighters bracing to receive a charge is one thing. The mind in that situation, while frightened, knows what to expect. A line of ordinary fighters bracing to receive men who were trembling with something that seemed barely to be inside their skins, who were howling or roaring with sounds that the sagas compare consistently to the sounds of wolves and dogs, who wore the pelts of animals and held their shields in their teeth rather than in their hands. That was something the mind did not know how to process, and the uncertainty itself was the weapon. The berserkers weaponized strangeness. They weaponized the ancient, animal-deep uncertainty about what was human and what was not. And in doing so, they often broke the enemy's resolve before the first physical contact, which was, militarily, exactly the point. A formation that breaks before the charge saves everyone a great deal of difficulty. The poem Haraldskviði captures something of this in its spare, precise kennings. It calls the berserkers tasters of blood, a phrase that modern readers understand as referring to the ravens that circled battlefields, those black birds sacred to Odin, who feasted on the fallen. But the phrase carries its double weight deliberately. The berserkers, too, were tasters of blood, men for whom combat was not a terrible necessity to be survived, but a form of devotion to be practiced, a ritual through which they renewed their relationship with the god who had given them their particular and demanding gift. The formation itself was deliberate and studied. When a Norse warband arranged itself before battle, the berserkers occupied the front rank, not because no one else would stand there, but because their presence at the front served a specific tactical function. They were the face of the force, the thing the enemy saw first and had to reckon with before anything else could happen. The Danes who faced Harald Fairhair's troops along the Norwegian coast, the chieftains of rival factions who watched his fleet come in through the fjord mist, they would have seen, at the waterline at the prow of the warband, these figures who were moving differently from the men behind them, who were already in the early stages of the state, the trembling beginning, the voices changing. The psychological work began before the first weapon was raised. It began the moment the enemy's eyes landed on the front rank, and the mind tried to categorize what it was seeing and found that it could not quite do so. Other Scandinavian kings of the period adopted the same practice. The herdmen, the household troops, the inner circle of a Norse king's military establishment were a layered institution, and the berserkers occupied a specific and honored layer within it. They were not merely soldiers. They were a signal of the king's own status and reach, evidence that he commanded men of a particular quality, men whose capacities extended beyond what ordinary training could produce. To have berserkers at your disposal was to have converted some portion of your political authority into a form that required no argument. It made its case simply by existing, simply by being visible in the right light at the right moment. The reputation of the berserker warbands traveled faster than the warbands themselves, and the reputation was part of the strategy. Outside of battle, the life of a berserker was more complicated, and the sagas record this complexity with their characteristic even-handedness. The qualities that made these men extraordinarily valuable in war made them genuinely difficult in peace. The sagas contain accounts of berserkers whose fury did not remain bounded by the battlefield. Men who in their ordinary lives could be volatile and unpredictable, who might take offense at a slight in ways that escalated beyond what the social codes of Norse society could absorb, who carried within them a fire that the social structures of the settlement were not quite built to contain. There are accounts of berserker bands who wandered from settlement to settlement and were sometimes welcomed, sometimes feared, sometimes endured with the careful and watchful tolerance that any community extends to something powerful and unruly that it cannot quite afford to drive away. The sagas also record something else about these men in their quieter hours, a capacity for devotion and loyalty that was the domestic counterpart of their battlefield devotion. They were bound to their kings, to their patrons, to the brothers of their warrior societies, with a commitment that the ordinary vocabulary of employment or service does not quite cover. These were not men who fought for wages, though they received gifts and honors. They were men who fought because they had organized the whole of their identity around this particular form of service, and the relationship between a berserker and his king had something of the quality of a religious relationship, mediated through the figure of Odin, conducted in the language of gift and reciprocal obligation that the Norse understood as the fundamental grammar of significant relationship. In the long halls of the great Norse chieftains, during the winter months when the sea was too rough for sailing and the farm work was done, and the settlement turned inward on itself, the berserkers sat with their patrons at the long tables and listened to the skalds perform their verses, and the verses were about them, about the qualities they were supposed to embody, the ideals their way of life was meant to express. Courage in the face of death, generosity to companions, loyalty to the Lord, who had offered protection in exchange for service. The berserkergang was not separate from these values. It was their extreme expression, the point at which ordinary courage became something else, something that had stepped through the doorway of the ordinary into whatever lay on the other side. The exhaustion that followed the fury described consistently across the saga sources, the weakness and the drowsiness, and the sense of having been used entirely and given back empty had its own quiet dignity. It was not shameful to need rest after having been the instrument of something that large. It was the natural consequence of having spent what the body held. And the community understood this. The berserker who lay down after the battle and did not move for half a day was not weak. He had given what he had to give, and now the replenishment was happening and everyone waited. The last warriors who bore the name berserker moved through a world that was already becoming something other than the world that had created them. The church was building in stone across Scandinavia, its forms and its theology gradually displacing the older practices that had shaped the Norse world for generations. The Thing assemblies, those remarkable outdoor gatherings where free Norsemen came together to deliberate on law and settle disputes, and maintain the community structures that made the settlements possible, were being slowly absorbed into legal frameworks derived from Roman and Christian models. The longships were still being built and still being launched, but the era of the great raiding expeditions was drawing to a close as the edges of the known world filled in, and the distant settlements that had been founded along Atlantic and North Sea coasts became communities with their own histories and their own needs, no longer frontier outposts but places. In this changed world, the berserker was a problem. What had been an asset in an age of expansion, a period when controlled and directed violence was the engine of political power, became a liability when the new Scandinavian kingdoms required a different kind of order. In 1015, Jarl Eiríkur Hakanarsson of Norway outlawed berserkers. The medieval Icelandic law code known as Gragaz went further, establishing berserker behavior as a formal legal category subject to outlawry, not merely a social inconvenience, but a matter for the law itself to address and resolve. By the 1100s, organized berserker warbands had ceased to exist as a recognized institution in Norse society. The great Icelandic saga known as Gretti's Saga, composed over a period of several centuries and set in an Iceland that was already more settled and more legally minded than the world of the earliest berserkers, features its hero, the outlaw Grettir the Strong, traveling through a countryside troubled by wandering berserker bands, men whose violence had become untethered from any useful social purpose, and who now simply moved from place to place, taking what they wanted and leaving damage in their wake. Grettir defeats them one by one, ridding the land of something that had once been honored and was now merely dangerous. It is a story about change, told in the objective register of the saga form, without editorial comment. The saga simply records what happened, and what happened was that these men who had once been placed at the front of the formation as a deliberate military strategy were now at the margins of the world, a problem to be solved by a different kind of hero, not a war king building power, but an outlaw trying to make himself useful to the community that had rejected him. There is something quietly sorrowful in this ending, not because the violence should be mourned, it should not, but because what passed with those warrior brotherhoods was also something else, a particular form of devotional practice, a particular relationship between the human body and the animal world, a particular kind of initiation that had carried young men across the threshold from one version of themselves to another. The bear and the wolf retreated from the living world into folklore and fairy tale. The animal skin ceremonies became stories that grandparents told to grandchildren, who had grown up in stone-walled churches and would never wear the pelt or stand in the cold forest at dawn waiting for something to arrive. Odin himself was gradually transformed from a living presence into a figure in old tales, his fury and his wisdom and his single, searching eye relegated to the library of what had been believed rather than what was believed now. Something ancient moved further from the living world, as ancient things do when the world changes around them. What survives is the language, and it is worth pausing on that fact because it is not nothing. The word berserk has traveled from the Old Norse berserker through nearly 800 years of use and slow transformation into the English you are hearing now, carrying across that vast distance the shape, if not the full weight, of its origin. When someone says that a situation has gone berserk, that a machine is running berserk, that a crowd has gone berserk, they reach without knowing it all the way back to those bare-coated warriors standing in a cold northern dawn, trembling with something that was not quite themselves, and not quite the animal whose skin they wore, but something held between those two things, something that the Norse understood as sacred, and that defied the ordinary categories of self and world. The word has softened in transit. It has lost its ritual weight and its specific geography and its devotional content. But the shape of the original meaning persists in it, the sense of a boundary crossed, of ordinary restraint dissolved, of something that lived below the surface of the everyday rising suddenly and completely to the surface. Every time the word is used, some distant, attenuated echo of those northern forests and those bearskin coats, and that particular quality of trembling that preceded the fury is present, barely audible beneath the noise of the modern world, but there. There is a carving that has survived from the Swedish province of Uppland, sometimes called the Bear runestone, which shows a figure whose form seems to move between human and animal, the boundaries between the two not quite fixed, the image holding both possibilities in the same moment. Whether this is specifically a depiction of a berserker in the technical sense, scholars debate. But it captures something true about the aspiration, the desire to carry inside the body, a power that the everyday world does not require and cannot contain. To know that somewhere beneath the surface of the ordinary self, there is something older and larger that can be summoned when summoning is what the moment requires. The Lewis chessmen, carved in Norway during the 12th century and discovered on a Hebridean beach in 1831 after centuries in the ground, include among their pieces several figures that scholars have identified as possible representations of berserker warriors. Broad-shouldered, wide-eyed, biting the tops of their shields in that gesture the sagas describe so consistently. They are made of walrus ivory, creamy and dense, and they sit now in museums in Edinburgh and London. These small, fierce figures, no taller than a human thumb, preserved in the middle of their biting as if the sculptor caught them in the moment before the state fully arrived, and simply kept them there, held at that charged and waiting threshold between ordinary and otherwise. They have been in museums for nearly 2 centuries. Before that, they were in the ground for 6 or 7 centuries, waiting in the dark of the earth. They have outlasted everything they depicted, and they are still here, still biting, still waiting at the threshold. There is a quality the sagas mention that tends to receive less attention than the fury itself, and it deserves its own moment in the telling. Between battles, the berserkers were ordinary men in many of the ways that mattered. The same sources that describe the howling and the shield biting also describe men who were skilled with their hands, who could carve and work metal and mend the practical things that needed mending. Men who in the long winter months sat near fires in the great halls and listened to the skalds and sometimes were the skalds, composing verses in the demanding skaldic tradition with its elaborate metrical requirements and its thicket of kennings. Men who maintained friendships and obligations, who were generous to those they valued, who could be gentle in the way that very strong people sometimes are, having nothing to prove in the ordinary run of things. The berserker state was not a permanent condition. It was a capacity, carried like a coal kept banked and covered within the body, capable of being brought to heat and light when the conditions required it, and then allowed to cool again when those conditions had passed. The wolf warriors of the Volsunga saga undergo their period of being entirely wolves and then return to human life. The wolf skins set aside, the ordinary self resumed, the extraordinary capacity held in reserve. This rhythm, the ordinary and the extreme, the everyday self and the thing beneath it, is perhaps the most human element of the berserker story, the element that resonates most fully across the distance of 1,000 years. We are all, in some degree, carrying capacities that our ordinary lives do not require. The musician who practices alone in a cold room for years, against the possibility of a single public performance. The person who discovers, in a moment of genuine crisis, that they are calmer and more resourceful than they would have predicted. The parent who finds, in an emergency, a speed and a strength that their ordinary life gives no indication of possessing. The berserkers formalized and ritualized and made sacred what is, in some less dramatic form, a universal human experience. The discovery that the self is larger than the self knows, that there is territory within the body that has not been fully mapped, that beneath the ordinary self with its ordinary calculations, there is something older and less bounded, something that has not forgotten what the species learned in the long millennia before settlement and law and the careful management of social life. The exhaustion that followed the fury, described consistently across the saga sources, the weakness and the sense of having been emptied, the period of lying quietly that could last for hours, suggests that the berserkergang was also a form of surrender. Not a gaining of power, but a spending of it, a pouring out of the body's deepest reserves, a giving over of the self to something larger than the self. And what followed the pouring out was what always follows any great expenditure, the slow, patient return of quiet. The body remembering its ordinary temperature. The breath finding its ordinary rhythm. The skin becoming sensitive again to small things, the roughness of the ground beneath a shoulder, the smell of smoke and wet wool, the distant sound of water moving over stones. The world the berserkers inhabited was itself a world of extremes. The Norse landscape imposed a particular emotional education on those who lived within it. Winters that lasted so long that the return of warmth could feel genuinely miraculous. Summers so brief and so saturated with light, the long northern twilights in which the sky never fully darkened, that they carried a quality of gift, of something given rather than simply occurring. The sea, which was both highway and hazard, which allowed the Norse to travel enormous distances, and which also swallowed ships and men without ceremony. The forests, which were dense enough to disorient and dark enough even in summer to feel like a separate country, existing alongside the settled world but not fully part of it. In this landscape, the berserker tradition makes a kind of sense. The environment itself required of the people who lived in it a capacity for extremity, for enduring cold, for working past ordinary exhaustion, for sailing into uncertain waters with confidence that the skills accumulated over a lifetime would be sufficient. The berserkers took this general cultural disposition toward endurance and intensity and pushed it to its furthest point, formalized it into ritual and brotherhood, placed it in the service of the god who was himself the deity of all extremity. Odin, who had sacrificed his eye and his comfort and 9 days of consciousness in the pursuit of deeper knowledge. Odin, who was never quite at rest, never quite still, always moving through the world looking for whatever the world had not yet given up. The Norse poets who described the berserkers, the skalds composing their intricate verses in the firelit halls of the great chieftains, understood these warriors as embodying something essential about the relationship between the human and the sacred. Not the quiet, domestic sacred of household gods and harvest rituals, but the wild sacred, the sacred that lived in the places where human settlement did not quite reach, in the deep forest and the open sea, and the moment before the storm when the air changes and the birds go silent, and the world seems to hold its breath. The berserker, in his animal skin, standing at the boundary between one thing and another, was a figure for all of that. The human being at the edge of what the human being is, looking outward into whatever lies beyond. The longhouses themselves told a version of this story. Those great timber halls, built long and low against the weather, with their central hearths and their heavy roof beams darkened by years of smoke, were the containers of Norse social life, the place where the community gathered at day's end, where food was shared and stories were told, and the bonds of obligation and affection were renewed in the ordinary way of daily life. The berserkers who sat in these halls between their periods of service were fully inside that world, fully domesticated by it in the good sense of that word, shaped by its warmth and its obligations and its requirements. And yet they also contained something that was not of the longhouse, something that had been formed in the forest, and that the forest had marked in a way that did not wash off. They were inside the domestic world and also partly outside it, belonging to both and fully captured by neither. This quality of existing at the threshold, fully human, and yet carrying something that exceeded the ordinary human, gave them their particular character in the Norse imagination, their particular resonance in the stories that survived them. The children who grew up in those longhouses, watching the berserkers sit by the fire, would have understood, even without being told explicitly, that these men were different in some way that mattered. The way they sat, the way they sometimes went very quiet, the way the older warriors looked at them with a particular kind of respect that was not the ordinary respect for age or skill, but something more careful, more acknowledging of something not entirely known. And some of those children would have grown into young men who felt in themselves a quality that matched what they had observed, something that was not satisfied by farming or sailing or ordinary trade, something that wanted the edge of experience, the threshold, the moment when the ordinary self is no longer adequate and something else is required. Outside, if you listen, the night is doing what nights do. moving slightly, settling into itself. Whatever sounds reach you from where you are, wind in whatever trees grow near your window, the distant sound of the world continuing its patient work, the small sounds of a warm and inhabited house arranging itself around its occupants. These are the sounds of a world that is, at this hour, very old and very quiet and entirely indifferent to the passage of centuries. The berserkers have been gone for 1,000 years. The bare forests of Norway are quieter now. The birch trees grown tall and close over the paths those initiates once walked in their long weeks of becoming. The amber-lit coastlines of Scandinavia still exist, the same stones worn smooth by the same cold water, the same winter light arriving at the same low angle to touch the same cliffs. The ravens still fly over those coasts, and they are still black, and they still watch with the same quality of attention that the Norse understood as something bordering on knowledge. But the men who stood in those forests with their hands pressed against the rough bark of trees and listened for something that answered, they are very far away now, held in the syllables of old poems and the careful work of scholars, and the particular quality of attention that storytelling makes possible late at night, when the ordinary business of the day has finished, and the mind, growing quiet, reaches back towards something it cannot quite name but recognizes when it finds it. You are warm. The breath is slow. The darkness has settled into something patient and unhurried, and you are held within it the way a coal is held within its cooling shell, the warmth still real, still present, simply quieter than it was. Let the old word rest now. Let the bear sleep in its winter darkness. Let the wolf settle into the long grass of whatever field it has found at the edge of the settlement, watching with amber eyes that reflect the stars. Let the story go. Sleep well.